YouTube is in, Facebook is in.
Donald Trump today in Warsaw, Poland, delivered what Vox is calling an alt-right manifesto, what other people might call a kind of a fantasy or a dream speech for the white supremacist movement around the globe. Speaking before an exuberant Polish crowd, which, it has been reported, was bussed in as per a contract that the Trump administration had with the Polish. He required that they had many screaming favorably fans for his speech in order for him to show up for it, which was then followed up by Trump administration officials and backers on Twitter saying, look at the videos and the photos of that adoring crowd. Isn't this absolutely tremendous? As if we didn't also know and had read the reporting that these were people that were bussed in and ordered by the Polish government to applaud for Donald Trump. But we're going to talk today about anything else you want in the comment section. Ask any questions that you want. You can tweet them to me at Ryan Grimm or put them in the comment section at Facebook. That's the one we're going to be reading here. What I want to start off by talking about is why specifically this speech was kind of such a celebration of white culture from Trump in such a stark and startling way. It is hard to continue to be surprised by Donald Trump, and in some ways it's just Donald Trump continuing to mouth the kind of rhetoric that is written for him by people like Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon. This particular speech was written by Stephen Miller, who has a kind of long, you could call it alt-right, white supremacist past or history. I'll just read a couple of lines from this speech, and then we'll talk to Eric, who's done a lot of reporting on this community in the past. But on the Facebook page, there's a link to a Vox article that quotes it more at length, or you can just Google and find the transcript yourself. But some of the lines go like this. What we've inherited from our ancestors has never existed to this extent before, and if we fail to preserve it, it will never ever exist again. So we cannot fail it. Other stuff like lots of references to culture, to memory, to other codes like so our freedom, our civilization, and our survival depend on these bonds of history, culture, and memory. And today, as ever, Poland is in our heart, and its people are in that fight. Just as Poland could not be broken, I declare today for the world to hear that the West will never ever be broken. Our values will prevail, our people will thrive, and our civilization will triumph. So, just to pick out a couple of those, our people. It's this alt-right language is able to take words that are completely innocent, like people, and use them in ways that could appear on the surface to be innocent, but are actually coded for people who, as part of this community, hear those words. When he says our people, he means something very precise. He is not talking about a big multicultural melting pot of a society, which we've always kind of thought of as the United States, even if it's a shared myth more than it is a reality. Our people means quite specifically white people, and when he uses West, capital W West, he's talking about kind of a white Western civilization. This language about Western civilization being on the brink of destruction is the kind of existential rhetoric that this movement has been using for years now to kind of draw sharp divisions between these different communities. And for the President of the United States to be adopting this language and using it in a speech abroad is quite an extraordinary thing. Eric Byler, who's editing and shooting this, has been interviewing members of this and related communities for years. So I wanted to talk to him briefly, and then and then we can take some questions from the audience as well. But Eric, I wanted to ask you, as you listen to this type of Trump speech, and you think back to your conversations with people on the road over the last 10 years who are parts of this somewhat connected movement, What was your first reaction to it?
Well, okay, on the campaign trail, I would meet people who were clearly Fox News consumers, Rush Limbaugh consumers, and so the stuff that I heard from them wasn't really as jolting because it was very familiar. We all hear it as much as you want to hear it. It's accessible. Down south, Alabama, South Carolina, sometimes in North Carolina, when there were questions about a Confederate flag or a monument coming down, we met people who would be much more in the root of what we today see as Fox News content, which is the Confederate lost cause argument about the Civil War not really being about slavery, about the Civil War being about states' rights and freedom, and that the North, people will refer to Abraham Lincoln as a terrorist or a tyrant, and they'll really focus on atrocities that were committed by the Northern Army as justification for terrorism in response, for the Jim Crow regime that was installed with that terror, for the terror that enforced Jim Crow, and for modern day expressions that are based on sort of Southern grievances that date back to the Civil War and Reconstruction. This third strain that I met, I only met one or two people at Trump rallies who sounded like this speech. And one of them, you might have seen the video, the guy said that we have to protect the world from Zionism, and Trump is going to put a stop to Zionism and immigration in America.
Non-white immigration, right?
Right. I'm sure that's what he meant. Right. But I was going back and forth with him about Zionism. And anyway, you can look that up. And then after the election, when I went to the alt-right convention, that's when I heard stuff like this. At the alt-right convention in Washington, D.C., maybe, 2 weeks after the election, that was when I heard people saying that Western civilization is being threatened by Muslims, by Latinos, by intermarriage. I remember them talking about, this is what we offer white women. We offer you pregnancy and strong men. And if you go outside of dating the white race, then you are some kind of slut who deserves to be killed. I mean, you look up the memes of Pepe the Frog shooting a woman in the head. But yeah, the biggest difference, I think, is that in that strain, they spent a lot of time not like with their head in the sling about some grievance that happened 150 years ago. They're focused on, right now, we need to essentially target these people for removal or these people from not being allowed to come in, dehumanize them by focusing on the worst things that any of them do. Like, for instance, when Trump has the parents of someone who was victimized by an undocumented immigrant. Dehumanize them so that any means necessary is justified to protect what's ours. So all three of those strains were, of course, thrilled by birtherism and the whole foundation of the Trump campaign, Muslim ban, the wall against immigration. But I was hoping that once he got in office that he would listen less to, even though all three of them are repugnant to me, honestly, that the alt-right, that's the scariest one. And to go to Poland to give a speech like this, that basically says to Europe, we need to unite as a white people against, one last thing. I'll quote something from way down south in Selma. An elected official, part of the Selma City Council, gave a speech on Confederate Memorial Day. And he actually gave the same speech twice. I was there 2 different years. And he said that we must protect our children, the white race, from this unholy trinity of multiculturalism, political correctness, and diversity. And this was before Trump announced. But I think that if you trace it all the way back to the Civil War and the grievances of white Southerners, many of them valid grievances, as long as you keep focusing on what's been done to me, what's being taken from me, it's a way to mobilize people to take actions that take away other people's rights or sometimes take lives.
And the big difference, or it's not so big, difference between the speech that he gave today and the kind of comments that you hear at alt-right conferences are, at the alt-right conferences, it is made explicit what the threat to Western civilization is, and it's made explicit precisely, if you ask, precisely what they mean by Western civilization. Whereas in Trump's speech today, he's saying Western civilization is under attack, and he kind of leaves it a little bit vague about who precisely, what precisely is attacking it, because he's still leaving a little bit of room for political correctness. Although in his speech he targets Islam. He talks about violent radical Islam, whatever his phrase of the day is for it, being the threat to civilization. So he's willing to mention that one by name, and he talks about immigration precisely, but he doesn't talk about how brown people are the threat, like in the explicit way that you will from the alt-right. But the words that they're using, ancestors, culture, civilization, Western civilization, are all the precise same words. And then that phrase at the end where he's like for family, for country, for God, like very kind of fascist overtones, and explicitly harking to those fascist movements. Like these are not accidental phrases that they stumbled on.
Well, I wish somebody had proofread it before that was given to him. There was a comment, maybe you guys can identify who it was, but it was about the age of Stephen Miller being a young man. And that was definitely true. You can look at my coverage of the alt-right conference. There were elder statesmen who'd written books that were for sale, and they had this erudite language, and they could basically, they would say, we need a moratorium on non-white immigration to America. Flat out. That's what we mean when we say immigration. We mean non-white immigration. That's what we want to stop. They're not worried about undocumented or any of the special little ways of phrasing it. And then you have the young men. So many young men. The kind of guys that I can identify with a little bit because I can see, there were hardly any women there, I could see that they have at once this desire to belong, and then they also have this deep insecurity about their own masculinity and their place in the world. And so this kind of language, but the elder statesman preys upon the insecurities of the young men. And so, Stacy, can you read that comment, that particular comment? Okay, come on in. She's just going to come in and out. This is Stacy, your intern.
Hi, guys. So the comment was from Lee Allen Meyer, and he says that the long and short history is because he's in his early 30s, just a lot of hate in his heart, with an emoji.
Okay, so people in the early 30s, maybe a little too much of a broad brush, but what do you think about that theory that the reason why it sounds like this is it was written by a younger alt-right?
Well, I mean, it means that he's very tied into that movement, and there are different parts of that movement. It developed differently at different times, and as your politics were shaped, you shape your politics in your late teens, 20s, and they evolve throughout your life, but the foundation of them is established, as you're coming of age and figuring out these issues. And for him, he's from Southern California, which can cut a lot of different ways for people. He seemed like he was picked on in high school, and he's kind of a misfit, and so he kind of retreated into this kind of white supremacy world, and made his way over to Jeff Sessions, and Jeff Sessions comes from a completely different type of
that's the lost cause of the Confederacy.
Right. Yeah. So you get these linkages there, and then they wind up with this guy like Trump who just went with it. He's had in the 1980s he suggested that the Central Park Five be executed, and he took out an ad saying that they should be, and he stood by that position even after they were found to have been innocent, which is just what are you talking about? And so he has, and there was a very toxic racial stew going on in the New York.
Just explain why.
In the 1970s, there was a run of austerity. Unemployment soared, inflation was soaring, crime was up. White people in New York felt under threat, and so this outer borough racism kind of crusted over during the 1970s, and he kind of came of age during that time. Trump's father was arrested at a KKK rally, and so this was in the 1930s when the communist movement was on the rise. The communists were associated with the burgeoning civil rights movement and with Jews. Like anybody who was anti-Semitic hated communists because they said communist was actually a global Jewish conspiracy, and they said, look, Lenin, Trotsky, all these guys, and so that's kind of the milieu that Trump is raised in. But beyond that, we don't have a lot of evidence that he's kind of part of the movement. He had these prejudices, but he wasn't part of the movement. And there's this fascinating radio interview that Steve Bannon did with him back when Bannon was just a Breitbart radio host, and Trump was just a clown that came on once a week. They were talking about immigration, and Trump says, "Well, of course we need skilled immigration. There are, like in India, for instance, tremendous engineers. We need those engineers to come into Silicon Valley." And as Trump does, he speaks in these very blunt overgeneralizations, but he's like, look, this is important to the Silicon Valley economy and to our country. We're educating all of these people, and then we're sending them back to India. He's like, that doesn't make any sense. They should stay here, and they should bring their genius and their expertise here, which is, I think, probably an opinion that is overwhelmingly shared by most Americans. And Steve Bannon's like, well, no, actually, we don't, because we need a civilization. So, and then he kind of jokes. He's like, I'm Breitbart. I have to be to the right of you all the time. But what Bannon means, we can't have the Indian engineers, even if they're better engineers, even if they were educated here, because we need white people in Silicon Valley. And if you have too many brown people in Silicon Valley, we don't have a civilization. That's what he means by civilization. You could probably find that. That one's more Googleable than others. So if you guys wanted to find that one, you probably can. But it's kind of a revealing exchange about what people like Miller and Bannon mean when they say civilization. And you can ask them, well, what is it about an Indian American or an Indian immigrant who's not necessarily even American that undermines civilization? Well, it's pretty clear what they mean by it.
Yeah. So I'll say one real quick thing, and then Nora, you ready with a comment or a question from the audience? Stacy? No?
No.
Okay. All right. So about Central Park 5, and really any time that Trump points at a crime of any kind, terrorism, a shooting, a stabbing, whatever it is, notice that if the perpetrator is white, it's of no interest. There's no political value to him. If the perpetrator is non-white, he knows there's political momentum for him in harping on it. And if you look at all the positions he took from the time he became a candidate, if there was a way to make it racial, he took a side that was going to appeal to the alt-right, to the Lost Cause Confederacy, and to the Fox News audience that gets a sanitized version of that. If it was something that wasn't necessarily about a race thing, for instance, one of Bernie's issues having to do with trade, even money in politics, if there was no racial element, then he just took Bernie's position, or at least edged toward it.
Or if the racial element is reversed. So if you have, like, a white guy who attacked the Canadian Parliament or whatever, like you've had many instances while Trump has been kind of this either president or a presidential candidate, where a white person has committed a terrorist act, and it's clearly a politically driven terrorist act, and he's just completely mum on it. And sometimes several days later, under pressure, he will finally say something about it. But it's in contrast to when there's a brown person involved, he's out immediately, before, and often he's been right that it did turn out to be some type of terrorist act.
Right, but not always, yeah.
But the shooting in Orlando, if you recall, there were still people trapped in there, and he's already
exploiting it for political gain
and telling you exactly what happened because he feels like he knows what happened.
Yeah.
But when it's a white person as the assailant, he just either doesn't say anything or Yeah.
Right. And so Stacey's going to come in with a comment. Come on, Stacey.
So we have a question from Lauren Hill. What about Lauren Hill.
Thanks for watching, Lauren.
So what about the congressman from Iowa, Congressman King? How does a person so racist keep getting elected in Iowa? How do we run against them in Congress?
Well, so the basic answer to the question of how does he keep getting elected, it's a deeply Republican district. As you move, and so the way that you're going to lose an election in a deeply Republican district is by getting outflanked on the right. And so as the kind of our racial politics get more and more explicit, the one way to make sure you don't get outflanked on the right is to become more explicit yourself in your own racist rhetoric. King is the one that
Cantaloupe. The cantaloupe.
That's his most famous one, the cantaloupe-sized calves or whatever.
They're drug mules with calves the size of cantaloupe. Speaking of Mexican immigrants.
Yeah. And that's just one, like he's just outdoing. He's the Trump before there was Trump, just outdoing himself over and over again. How do you beat people like that? In some districts, progressives are starting to run as Republicans to try to win in a primary. In a one-party area, the only election that matters is the primary, because everybody who turns out at the general just casts the vote for the R or for the D in like Washington, D.C. Changing the culture and suppressing this kind of Trumpism is really the only answer long-term, that you have to make this overt racism detrimental to their politics.
Yeah, in Arizona, when SB 1070 was passed, a moderate Republican ran in the primary against the state senator who introduced that bill and defeated him. So in many ways, it requires coalition building between progressives and Republicans who we may not agree with them on a lot of issues, but when it comes to the exploitation of racial and other forms of hatred for political gain, many moderate Republicans find it, well, let's just say almost as disgusting as progressives. And I say almost because many of them, they'll still get behind the Trump candidacy, or they'll still hold their nose or do whatever. I don't quite understand the logic, but they'll do it if they need it to win the election. Many of them. Others just leave the party and become conservative independents. And those people are valuable too. Steve King is almost the first word of the movie 9500 Liberty, which is basically my baptism by fire into politics. When the county I was living in Prince William County, Virginia, they introduced the immigration law requiring the police to check immigration status based on your appearance. It's the same thing that happened in Arizona a couple of years later. And the very first thing you hear is this old white man who walks up to a bunch of Latino families on the other side of a fence, and he says, "I want you to listen to what Steve King has been saying on C-SPAN." And this is 2007. So really, ever since the end of the Bush administration, when it became clear that it wasn't going to be seen by history as a successful administration, conservatives were scrambling for another way to organize. And so
they defeated immigration reform in like 2005 or whatever it was.
Right. They had defeated immigration reform in 2005, and then they did it again, I think, in 2006, even after Democrats had taken over the Senate. So I think Democrats had the Senate and the House by that point, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So what they had found is these things like Numbers USA, Federation of American Immigration Reform. The email database had just come to life, and so blogs were just coming online, and so many conservatives said the one opportunity we have is to go on the anti-immigrant thing, and basically bucking all of the John McCain's who would say, I don't know why I put air quotes on John McCain, but all that. But John McCain would say, no,
even George Bush.
Yeah. But so that's the way to separate themselves from the establishment, from George Bush, by saying, well, we're going to go harder on immigration. And so Steve King, Tom Tancredo ran for president in 2008. They were the first politicians to really try to use that. They saw tremendous power on basically pooling all of the people who subscribe to these beliefs on the internet into email databases, who could write to the Prince William County Board of Supervisors posing as constituents to get them to pass this law, who could terrorize, no, I shouldn't say terrorize, but frighten lawmakers even at the congressional level by just pummeling them with emails before they realized that you could just do that, with a digital trick. So that has progressed during the Obama years into something that is a little bit more virulent and a little bit more daring in expressing, we just have to call it what it is, hatred.
So thanks for joining us. I'll leave you with one useless anecdote.
And I have a pitch too.
At the 2008 Iowa caucuses, I was covering them. I was in the same hotel as Tom Tancredo, and I wound up right next to him in the buffet line. So I got to watch him eat his eggs right before his career went up in flames and he was wiped out in Iowa. So that at least happened.
That's true.
But
McCain
what he stood for lived on. Anyway, and you can plug here.
Yeah, McCain won, and then Romney won as well.
And they have used that as the argument that that's why you don't do McCain and Romney.
You need a Trump. Yeah. Okay, so this book is called, I'm not going to say it.
You can read it.
You can read it. So Dave Daly is a former editor-in-chief at Salon. He wrote this book about gerrymandering. So for the question we got about how Tom Tancredo can win, it has to do with the shape of his district. And some of these districts, especially if you look in swing states, they're created by Republican lawmakers at the state level, and they're designed to basically pack all the people of color into as few districts as possible, and then draw from these wide geographic regions that have more sparse populations of white people to create the majority of districts. And this is true in Ohio, North Carolina, Virginia, enough states that it actually flips Congress in such a way that the majority of Americans vote for Democratic members of Congress, but Congress has a big majority in the way that the seats are issued. So this book is all about that, and it's been updated for the paperback edition to talk about 2016 and the impact it had on 2016. I'll be interviewing David Daly later this month, and so people who would like to get a question to him, you can tweet it at me at Eric Byler, or we'll be doing part of that interview live, and you can get a question to him live if you read the book first. Well, actually, no, you can ask him if you don't read the book, but check it out.
All right, thanks, folks.
Okay. You ready to hit the... Okay.